I'm going to not do that. I'm going to introduce our speaker first. So every year, Inspired Discoveries has a lunchtime faculty speaker from around the university. You're sharing your research and creative activity. We want to hear about the research and creative activity of a faculty member. And so this year we have Dr. Nusta Carranza-Ko, who's from the College of Public Affairs. Applause. Woo! And Dr. Ko is also the chair this year of our faculty research council in a happy coincidence. So she's all about promoting research and scholarship. So we're delighted to have her. I'm going to say 3 things about her because she told me to be short, and then I will let her talk for about 30 minutes. Dr. Ko's research focuses on gender and human rights and justice in kind of transnational or different contexts around the world. So that's included both East Asia and South America. A little bit about what she's going to talk about today, I think. In addition to that, she is also someone who is interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So not traditional research, but research around how to be a better teacher. And so as part of that, she's published and presented with Michael Shackett, who's the interim dean of the library, on using open educational resources in teaching in her discipline. And you also wrote that wild Game of Thrones themed book that I don't remember the details of. But the point is, she does interesting stuff. So that's why we asked her. And I think today she's going to talk to us for about a half hour about a book that you're almost done getting ready to publish, right? All right, so I'm going to give her the mic. I'm going to set up her slides, and away we go.
Thank you.
So just stand here and
okay.
Put that behind you.
So I'm supposed to not move. My best. I'm a hugger and a walker, which doesn't really work to my advantage. I know I have a few students on Zoom, so I just wanted to say hi to Julia and Oscar, who I know are tuning in, and I'm gonna try to keep a timer on because academics love to talk about themselves and their stuff. So I just want to make sure I'm not going to over endorse the stuff that I'm working on. So it's a little bit of a heavy subject, if you will, but I think it's timely in many different ways. I think this is something that can be applicable to the American context when we talk about women's reproductive rights movements, reproductive justice. At the same time, there are dimensions to genocide, which I know that's a term that gets thrown around a lot these days. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion, not necessarily only related to my book manuscript, but something that also can be expanded, perhaps related to each of your fields and your interests. I noticed some of the titles of the presentations had to do with memory, for instance, very much built into this idea, historical narratives and whatnot, among other things. So I'm excited to talk about this, and I'm supposed to point it this way. Doesn't work. So I'm going to point it this way. Doesn't work. Is it on? It is on. I know it worked 5 minutes ago, but that's okay. I can do that. It's not working. Then I'm going to hover this around and yes. Okay. So now it's working. So I can manage technological failures, and that's okay. So I wanted to first give you the context of the crime. So for those of you who may not be aware of, we're talking about the country of Peru. So Peru had an internal armed conflict period from 1980 to 2000. And I guess maybe part of the reason why I study Peru is because I'm part Peruvian. And the other part, as you can clearly tell from my, I guess, obvious identifier, is that I'm half Asian descent or Korean. So that's the one that dominated over this face. And that's the result of, profiling being one way or the other, probably easily on the streets more than the other. But I am Peruvian as well, primarily of the indigenous peoples of the northern part of the Andes, who are Quechua-speaking peoples. And that's also the reason why I became very much interested in this case of the Decade of Terror. And literally, this was the Decade of Terror. So this is a slide that has a lot of information that probably doesn't mean a lot of things. I think I can bring this down. Yeah. So just as a context, there's lots of information here. You don't have to follow every single thing, but just to give you an overview as to what was happening, 1980 to 2000, we have the internal armed conflict period, which is basically a period of conflict between the state versus leftist subversive forces. And we had 2, and they were classified officially by the US State Department as terrorist groups. So we actually had 2 active terrorist groups. And mind you, this is also the period of the Cold War. So I think there's lots of Cold War related context also going on here as well. And we had the MRTA, which is the revolutionary movement of Tupac Amaru. For those of you who like hip hop, Tupac's name actually comes from Tupac Amaru, who was a revolutionary indigenous leader in Peru, and he was supposed to basically symbolize I guess, the messianistic idea of the Incas coming and the revolution and revolt against the Spanish crown and the Spanish type dominated colonial system that continues to carry on even to the present day. And so that's kind of one of the terrorist groups. The other terrorist group was also known as the Shining Path. And that's a Maoist terrorist group. And by Maoist, I'm talking about Mao Zedong, as you probably might know, who had led the revolution in China. And so inspired by the agricultural revolution, I would say, I'm not sure if that was actually a communist revolution, but the agricultural revolution that was happening in China, you also have the offshoots of the Shining Path coming through. Again, Cold War dynamics, left versus, and the democracy, the good guys and the bad guys, that kind of dynamic was happening during this time. So that's in red, the internal armed conflict period. During this time, we have various presidents coming and going, and that's the list of the presidents here on this side. So my apologies, again, lots of information on a single slide. These are the three presidencies or administrations that existed during this period. And in particular, I guess the period that matters the most to talk about is the Alberto Fujimori period. And that's the period during which you also have this coercive sterilization program, which originally started off as a positive women's rights, reproductive rights related policy, which is also, I abbreviated it here, which was a national policy for reproductive and family planification. So it was a program that was essentially for women's rights, very progressive, supported actually by women's rights organizations. In fact, he was able to come up with the idea of the program by his talk that he gave at the UN Beijing Women's Conference in 1995. I was having this conversation with a journalist yesterday exactly about this point, about how he was very positively received at the women's conference because of the other contextual part, which is, most Latin American countries are Catholic. Peru is a very heavily Catholic country. And so anything to do with reproductive rights, giving informed consent for the women to be able to decide this and that, kind of goes against the Catholic ideas of how things have to be done. And so there was actually a lot of pushback when Alberto Fujimori was originally trying to advance this idea of, family planning policy and reproductive rights related policy in Peru. So again, very much welcomed by women's rights organizations and whatnot. But what actually ends up happening during this period is that you actually see a significant level of concentration of this policy, not necessarily in the urban centers where, the richer people live, or, the higher classes of people that look a certain way, because ethnicity, class are very much associated within Peruvian politics and Peruvian society, where generally the whiter or the lighter the skin color you have, you tend to be more seen as and likely have more access to economic resources, political resources, and social resources and whatnot. And unfortunately, that's not only a situation of Peru, that's generally replicated throughout many different areas throughout Latin America. Primarily, I would say in areas where you actually had the more stronger manifestation of the Spanish viceroyalties. So Mexico has a strong manifestation of that. And you also see a very strong manifestation of that also in Peru. So lots of developments. I think we can also talk about the post-colonial side and things like that. So that was part of the research framing that was getting done. The part here that you see on the slide regarding transitional justice, this is something that Mike Hiel had mentioned about part of my research. So in reality, I began this research not because, I was brilliant. No, I actually was starting to get interested in this research because I started doing research on transitional justice. And the reason why I started doing research on transitional justice was because I was angry. So I think personal stories of anger really help. What the students are doing currently in diverse universities throughout the US, it's also a form of anger and frustration, right? I think anger is a good pivoting emotion, perhaps, maybe there's more information from psychology, so I'm not going to go there, that you can hang on to, that gives you the drive to be able to go to the next step and, engage in some level of action. So this was my level of engaging in activism by focusing on a case that had not even received enough input within the context of Peru. So we did have a truth commission. We did have criminal accountability of one of our former heads of state, particularly Alberto Fujimori. He was convicted in 2009 for crimes against humanity. That's a very fancy way of saying he killed a lot of people. He knew what he was doing. Even though he didn't go out there and kill someone, he was actually convicted for what is known as mediated authorship. And I'm mentioning that with the precise reason to say that not all leaders of the world can be not held or not be criminally accountable for, even though you weren't there to kill someone. So there is a way to try in international law, and I see a smile from Michael, regarding this notion of mediated authorship. And the other, I think, grounds on which Fujimori was not convicted, but perhaps other dictators were, had to do with this notion of universal jurisdiction. In international human rights law and human rights norms, there is the idea that certain types of crimes are so heinous that even though the perpetrator or the one committing the crime is not directly, maybe that state has not ratified a particular document, it doesn't matter. Certain types of crimes are so heinous that it supersedes those kinds of ratifications, and you can hold someone criminally accountable. Just throwing those ideas out there in case you need talking points for future purposes, which I think, may be valid. I see a few smiles in the room, so I think we are all thinking similarly on that point. So, again, coming back to transitional justice, this was what was happening with the family planning program was not included in any document. I mean, there were congressional records, there were NGO reports, but nothing else in terms of transitional justice. It was not included in the Truth Commission report, in part because of the fact that this was not a victimhood that was caused between the state and the leftist subversive forces. This was a victimhood coming out from a state health policy or family planning policy. So they saw this group of victimhood that emerged from here, which were the coercive sterilization victims, roughly 295,000 women and men who were coercively sterilized. They saw that group as being, well, you don't fit the category, so we can't include you in. So then I like to, talk about the subaltern or the marginal guy in the room. So I started focusing on why they had not been included. So that kind of began my journey of this type of research. So personal story, as I already mentioned before, there was that personal connection. I think it was also a personal story because I started reflecting upon the idea that the majority of my cousins and relatives in Peru do live in the rural side. They don't live in the Lima centers and whatnot. Then I started wondering that this could have been maybe one of my aunts. This could have been somebody that I knew indirectly, one way or the other, because the majority of this policy was being targeted only in rural areas in Peru. And rural areas in Peru is a code word to say where the majority of the people do not necessarily speak Spanish. So then what languages do they speak? Other indigenous languages or indigenous languages, which can be a combination of Quechua, Ashaninka, it can be Aymara, different types of languages. All that is to say, the targeting was purposeful. It was purposely aimed at indigenous peoples, in particular indigenous women, to coercively sterilize them. And the reasoning regarding that had to do with post-colonial ideas as looking at indigenous women as a dispensable population that do not deserve necessarily to exist. And they knew that even if they did that, they could get away with it. Because, indigenous peoples, subaltern groups of society peoples. I mean, again, the reason why I'm saying that I think there's a lot of relevance to this, even within the American context, Canadian context as well, is because it's the same kind of treatment that is always given to these subaltern groups. And I think that gets replicated over and over. In the book, what I tried to do was also to bring in a methodological focus that would be just and correct in approaching the victims. And what do I mean by that? These are stories of indigenous women. These are stories of that deal with indigenous communities. So one thing that I wanted to do was to be very careful in the way that I was going to be almost like an interlocutor. I was a mediator in providing I wasn't, giving voice. I think that is a word that always like kind of makes me a little bit cringe because I'm not giving voice to these women. They have voice. The victims and survivors can speak. They are very strong peoples, but what I wanted to do as the researcher and scholar was to take a step back and say, okay, how can I put your words and your stories into this book in a way that's respectful to you? And me, I'm just providing a space for you because you are now claiming space in the book, and this is going to be part of the greater journey in the story. So to do that, I engaged in indigenous methodology of storytelling. And I know maybe Oscar, maybe you might remember this from my class, but I like to engage in other forms of non-traditional methodological approaches, particularly when you deal with populations that do not necessarily have the same level of tradition or same type of tradition as you do, whether it's a Western culture or whatever cultural context, which is the reason why I wanted to bring that idea in. Interestingly, like storytelling is very much, a part of Canadian Indigenous studies academia as well, Native American studies here as well. So I think there's a lot of resonance to that in trying to give the voice, not give, sorry, to try to be the one that mediates and provides space for the voice to be heard, which was the methodology of storytelling that I engaged in. So I'm going to actually skip that because I already talked about it. But I wanted to concentrate on this quote. And this was also the reason why I think I became angry. Because I was talking to one of the executive secretaries or the executive representatives of a very famous NGO in Peru, and we were talking about the coercive sterilization case. And this is how she characterized it. She said it was a trashing of human rights, in this case of indigenous women. And by that, she was referring to the coercive sterilization case. But I think the word trashing really got to me. I was like, why is she using that word trashing? And I think by saying that, I think what she was trying to do was get to the idea and identity of where indigenous women are in Peruvian society, which is a dispensable population, as I mentioned before, that does not necessarily, will not necessarily get the accountability, whether it's judicial or non-judicial, in terms of the crimes that they have suffered. And this is like a repetition from the internal armed conflict, repetition, if you will, if you want to go way far back as a historian, perhaps to even the original encounter moments and the original moments of the Spanish settlements taking place in Peru and also in Mexico in a forced way. That involve numerous human rights violations, which you can easily access if you just read, for instance, the friar Bartolome de las Casas. If you read his diaries, you can actually see the documentation of the human rights violations that indigenous people suffered, but nothing was done about it. So then I started, the anger started building up. And the good thing is, if you have an anger, that means that you are continuing to be interested in. One thing that I've noticed, and I think maybe you can agree with that, is that the best thing for research is not to be bored. So anger doesn't mean that you're going to be bored. Anger means that you're going to be interested. Anger means you're going to feel motivated. You want to read a next page. You want to read a little more. You want to actually do extra research to be able to make this work. So that helped me out in being able to frame this. This was actually, I'm not trying to tout my horn, but this is one of the chapters that's included where I actually framed this case as a genocide. And this is the first attempt that has been done in scholarship to frame this case as a genocide. And it was part of my previous publication regarding genocide about this case as well. Interestingly, when I was talking to human rights lawyers and friends who work in the field, I asked them, why won't this case be considered as genocide? And one of the reasons why people don't want to use that word is because, especially lawyers, they don't want to use that word, is because this is the hardest crime to prove. You have to prove the fact that there was some level of, premeditated intent. So some level of policy, some documentation that reveals the fact that there was a systematic concerted effort to annihilate this one particular population that was different, whether it was ethnically, religiously. Gender still has not been included in any of the amendments. So I know, I just saw Sally's face. Yes, I totally agree. That's a separate matter that maybe we should engage in at some point. But in the official convention, the Genocide Convention, you don't see that being mentioned. So again, the hardest crime to argue, which is the reason why international human rights lawyers don't want to engage. That's the reason why for any kind of heinous crimes, you're going to see crimes against humanity being mentioned very often. Crimes against humanity is very bad too. I mean, it's a crime against humanity. I mean, that's very bad. I mean, somebody must have done something really bad if it's a crime against humanity. But genocide, it's something of a category of its own. It's a crimes against humanity plus more, which is the reason why I thought it was important to make the argument as a genocide for this case, so that it establishes some level of precedent, so that it becomes a precedent for future conversations or can even be used as part of a lawsuit. Because that's the thing, like sometimes, I get frustrated thinking, I'm just an academic, I'm sitting in front of my computer, I've gathered all this evidence, and what do? I just produce this article that half the time only people that I know are going to read. And that's not going to have any repercussions or any policy influence. But what is great is that it does have policy influence. If you're able to publish that, then that gets used in the courts to be able to make the argument that experts are arguing this. Experts are viewing this as a form of genocide and whatnot. And that really helps out. So part of the reason why I did this was because of, I guess, that activist lens that I had. And I wanted to bring the idea together as to why it was important. So just to expand on that point that I mentioned, so it has to have, the guilty mind or the mens rea, and the guilty acts, which is the actus reus, which had to do with, maybe I can raise this up now so that it's not blocking. Yeah, well, that's blocking, but there's nothing we can do. So essentially, if you look at the Ministry of Health documents, multiple congressional reports, Human Rights Ombudsman's Office investigations, non-government organization reports, even newspaper articles that were published about this case, already irregularities were being manifested about this policy, which was implemented in 96, in 97. So this is like within a year, there was a quota, like we have to sterilize this amount of peoples. And so at times nurses felt compelled to sterilize themselves because they had to meet the quota. And if you didn't meet the quota, then, you would get repercussions in the sense that you might not get promoted, or you might, is the word demoted the right word? Yes, demoted, sorry, not a native English speaker, so I can totally ask questions here. So that would be a process through which people would feel pressured in complying with the number of quota or the peoples that they had to sterilize. But interestingly, as I go up to the top, again, maybe I'll hover over, women were the target group, but not all women were the target group. This policy was not implemented. It was not discussed in, high society classes, nice neighborhoods. So if we think about this within Baltimore, it wasn't discussed in Roland Park. It wasn't discussed in Guilford or all that exciting, I don't know, Poplar Hill, Cross Keys, but it was discussed in the more extremist areas where you see heightened levels of poverty and whatnot, and with a particular ethnic identifier, right? So I think that is important to emphasize because not all women, indigenous women, were the focus. And so that drove my next part to examine not only that, frame this as a genocide, but I wanted to start becoming a non-academic. And I'm not trying to criticize academics, but at times in academia, stop laughing, Mike, we tend to not associate directly with the peoples that have had encounters. I know, Sally, your research is very much involved, participatory, so it's different. But in other cases, people are crunching numbers and that's all they do. So what I wanted to do was actually bring in, victim stories and talk with them directly. And in many cases, I was able to do that effectively. And this was actually during COVID. So this was a story that I heard through WhatsApp. which is, most foreigners use WhatsApp. So that's a way that you can tell that you do research in the foreign context. So this is the story of Sarita, and I wanted to bring that story with you or with me today because I wanted to show you maybe, I guess a direct experience of a victim who was sterilized against her will at the age of 17. So this is not only a genocide. In the book, what I do is there's a genocidal element, but now we have a children's rights violation element. So that is like, you kill a bunch of people who look different than you, okay. And those are all women, that's terrible. But now you touched on the children. Those are very bad people. I mean, there needs to be something done. So then, interestingly, this was one of the first documented cases of minors or people coming out saying that they were sterilized when they were a minor. And in her case, as you can see, she clearly says that she was taken to the hospital for a quick cleaning. So oftentimes they would be given the wrong information, misinformed consent, or consent in Spanish, even though the person was only a Quechua speaker or some other indigenous language speaker. And oftentimes, health officials would say, well, they should have asked for a different form. They don't have other forms. And most medical personnel are coming from the bigger cities. They do not actually have that possession of that cultural knowledge, linguistic knowledge that relates to these peoples, which is a problem on its own. So she felt pain. They didn't actually do anything. She was unable to have more than the children that she already had. She got chastised for already being 17 and actually having 2 children. She wasn't able to have any more children after this point forward. And in her case in particular, her partner left her. And she kept talking about the fact that she felt marginalized both in society, marginalized in her community, and how everything became a failure. And that's something that she kept mentioning over and over again. She said she felt like a failure because of, the fact that she didn't know what was happening to her. Failure in the sense as an indigenous woman who was unable to reproduce anymore because reproduction is a very, very important element of indigenous identity and whatnot. And she also felt embarrassed. This notion of embarrassment, though, is very much common among victims of sexual violence, which is the reason why I think there's also a lot of discussion that we can have regarding sexual violence victims currently, and maybe previously as well, and then how that relates. And in addition to the victims, I also wanted to talk to the victim activists and their movements. So I was able to talk with a lot of the activists in person. My goodness, her face is totally blurred. Maybe I'll go to her. Her face looks less blurred. Indigenous woman, indigenous rights leader, with whom I was able to talk with and who has been fighting for justice regarding the women and the kids for a very, very long time. And again, I was able to listen to her story directly. And I think there is something extra that you get when you engage directly in a discussion with these people that have been involved on the ground for a very long time, which was part of the reason why I wanted to make that effort and, be the one conveying their stories directly. The status of justice is not great. Understatement. There is a legal case that is open for investigation in Peru currently, but nothing as of yet has happened further in terms of this case. I'm going to leave it at that in case there is room for more discussion. Thank you.
Microphone on. Yeah, it's the only way for everyone online to hear. So we have maybe like 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and Dr. Farley's going to go first.
So thank you so much. This was fascinating. My first thought was, if nurses are undergoing sterilizing themselves, is there any evidence of conscientious objectors who just didn't do it, said that they did it and didn't do it?
There were objectors. They left the medical field. I don't know if there were people that said that they did it and they actually didn't do it. That I don't know. Yeah, that I'm not sure if I do know. But I was able to hear from one of my family members who was actually a nurse. she spoke Quechua because Quechua was her mother tongue. She told me very directly that she had been hearing about these irregularities and that there was a team in the hospital where she worked where people were going hush hush. Like a lot of this stuff was occurring on the side. So even within the same hospital network, some nurses or medical team did not know that there was a team separate, I guess, gaining extra money by doing this and going to rural areas and performing these acts. Interestingly, at times there is documented evidence that at times sterilizations were occurring without anesthesia. And there was barely any medical follow-up, which is the reason why some women who were coercively sterilized have passed away. And some of those cases were able to be discussed at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. One of those cases is currently open in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And to get to the Inter-American System of Human Rights, you have to have exhausted all domestic remedies, meaning they try domestically to figure out some level of retributive justice or criminal accountability for these peoples, for the victims, especially their family members tried, but it didn't go through, which is the reason why they went to the Inter-American system. But to your specific question, I'm not sure. You know, that's actually a very good question. I never thought about that. Maybe I actually believed all the numbers. Yeah. Yeah, but that's a very good question.
Anyone else? Students? Oh, one online. Go ahead.
Maggie asked if there is any possibility of an international court case over this.
Is there any possibility of an international court case?
I need the mic, Mike. So there is, as I mentioned, there is one case that's open in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is the case of Celia Ramos, and she's a woman who was coercively sterilized. It's her daughters who actually took the case up. They first took it to the Inter-American because the state did not respond to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights request for settlement. What happens then, it goes to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So there is one case. And I think that is very important because there's at least one case. At the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, there was a 2003 ruling that was settled with the Peruvian state and the victims and victims' family members, well, victims' family members because the victim died, which was the case of Maria Mestanza Chavez versus Peru in 2003. The state has yet to pay up all the reparations regarding what, the harm that was caused. And so that's a separate matter. The judicial case that is open for investigation, I guess investigation in quotes, in Peru, it's a collective suit that includes roughly 2,074 women plus more who are all coercively sterilized or who claim that they were coercively sterilized. Interestingly, just to give you one extra caveat, this happened during the regime or administration of Alberto Fujimori. He was convicted in 2009 for crimes against humanity for 25 years, but he was released once in 2017 on humanitarian grounds, went back to jail because it was illegal. You can't release someone who's been convicted for crimes against humanity. And then he went back to jail, and then he was released again in 2023 on humanitarian grounds again. And every time he gets released is depending on the, particular president that tends to be in favor of that guy and his family. And so, I mean, he's the one they're asking for criminal accountability, him and his cronies or his ministers. Some of those health ministers are currently in the government. They are congressmen, so they are high-level exec people that it's going to be a very, very, very long battle ahead. Yeah.
I believe Oscar raised his hand.
Oscar, unmute yourself.
Can you talk about the challenges of finding these stories, engaging with them? Can you talk more about your experience?
Yeah, I think one thing that helps me out is that I'm a woman. The other thing that helps me out is that I'm Peruvian, but I look different. So I don't look like the so-called, majority elite that maybe these victims dash survivors would see as being menacing. So that kind of provides me a little bit of a grounding to engage with them. The other thing that I try to make sure is I'm very careful to not ask too many questions. I leave it open for the women and the activists and whatnot to be able to tell me their stories. I don't want to distort. I don't want to frame one thing as the other, because what I'm trying to do is, as a researcher, not cut out parts that I can use effectively from my research so I can publish it out perfectly. Yes and no. I mean, that would be amazing, but that's not the purpose of this book, which is the reason why the publisher that I have the advanced contract with is the University of California. And the editor has been very, very supportive of the idea and my approach in bringing these women's stories forward in exactly the way that they are hoping for it to be portrayed. Because in a way, some might say this is an appropriation of someone else's victimhood and being represented. So I want to do the right thing and be respectful towards their experiences, the hardships. I mean, I've cried with these women together over the phone. One of them, one of the victims that I identified is now has been granted asylum in Canada because she was facing so many death threats. So she was invited for a conference in Canada and then declared asylum status there as soon as she got there. There's lots of, women that have gone through so many different traumatic moments in their lives that I try to do what I can ethically, in trying to provide space within the text. And now I sound very like a literary scholar. But I try to do that so that, that those ideas get conveyed. If I may leave this part of the talk with one last comment, this is not a Peruvian issue. It's happened here in the US before, not only to indigenous populations, but Latinx populations as well. There's like the book No Más Bebés, talks about the Los Angeles case. And there's cases in indigenous women's rights violations cases and genocide cases in Canada as well. So this is not a Peru story. I think this can be seen as a universal story that applies and it threatens women's reproductive rights in many different ways.
Anything else online?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to ask one last question and then thank you. So I thought this was really interesting because I'll stand in the camera so people can see me as the host. It's interesting because your research, as you said, you're trying to do something that's not just in the academy, but goes outside the academy. And you're also doing something that uses a lot of different research methods, right? Like historical documents, personal story, like it's super interdisciplinary and kind of interesting. And it's also really heavy and like emotionally and morally. And for someone in the United States, right, like it's about a topic that no one is familiar with. So I was just curious, did that make it hard to get someone interested in publishing it? Because people think like, oh, no one's going to care about these people, or do you kind of get what I'm asking?
It depends on who you're talking to. I actually got a lot of requests for meetings by people that publish on gender studies. So there was more interest from the gender studies folks. There's less interest from the international relations types of folks. And that's okay. And I think I can do that now because I'm fine. I'm tenured and I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable.
It's like, would you have been willing to do this before you?
Well, I did publish the genocide piece before tenure. So yes, the answer is yes. This is an important matter. I think this can be, it is interdisciplinary. Fine. Does that mean that it, deviates from the mainstream discourse of IR, blah, blah, blah? Yeah. And so what? Somebody needs to say it and somebody needs to bring it as part of the discourse so that it becomes mainstream. I mean, that's how it is, right? We have to make something mainstream. Women's rights was not mainstream back in the days. We made it mainstream. So this is one of my efforts.
Thank you, Dr. Ko. That was super interesting.